Hello and welcome everyone to American University. I am your moderator, Kathleen O'Dowd, and today's webinar is the first of our fall 2020 web series on skills to the 21st century evaluator. The web series is sponsored by our online Master's in Measurement and Evaluation program through our School of Professional Extended Studies. Today we have a special guest speaker, but Professor Peters, let me hand it over to you first. You can give a brief introduction.
Great, thanks, Kat. My name is Bev Peters, and I am a faculty member with American University's Measurement and Evaluation program. You can check me out on LinkedIn to learn more about me. And before we hear from our speaker, let's hear a little bit from you. Where are you joining us from today? If the audience could put in the chat box where it is that you are dialing in from, and maybe Kat can let us know where it is that our audience is dialing in from.
Sure. So far we have Miami, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., another Washington, D.C., Kansas, the Netherlands, Pakistan, Seattle, Boston, Toronto. We're all over the place.
Wow, that's great. That's wonderful. Today we are hearing from Jara Dean-Coffey. She is founder and director of the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. We all know who Jara is, so I'm not going to read a bio, but I wanted to start out by reading a question that she wrote as an introduction to this webinar. This question frames our discussions today, and it has really gotten me to think a lot about my evaluation work over the course of the past few weeks. What if evaluative practice was not only about something, but for something? It's very powerful. What if evaluative practice was not only about something, but for something? This is an important question for all of us as evaluators, and I am delighted that Jara is here to lead us in this discussion.
Great. Thank you, Beverly. Greetings, everybody. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are in the world. I'm going to try to talk for maybe 35 minutes. Feel free to ask questions at any point in time. I'll create some space for that, and hopefully we can filter some things. And then I actually want us to try to have a dialogue to the degree to which that's possible. So, how do I want to start this? I think what we have here is an evolutionary opening. We have an opportunity to really think about how our evaluative practice actually is for something. And that for we like to propose is actually equity. We at the EEI, at the initiative, don't think we can tinker around anymore on the edges around methods and demographics as the way to get to evaluative practice that is actually meaningful and relevant. We actually think we have to do something fundamentally different and transformational. So really what I'm going to talk about is what we're proposing for the field. When I say the field, we're really talking about the philanthropic sector. It's uniquely positioned to do things that other sectors aren't able to do, which is why our work is situated there, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have implications for those of you that work in other sectors. But before I talk about the future, I'm going to talk a little bit about the present, go back in time, and then offer the invitation. So when I first started doing this work and actually first prepared this slide, I had no idea we would be where we are in 2020. And yet, if I think about it, where we are was unavoidable. The ways in which the United States has been grown over the years, decades, centuries means that all of those demons have come home to roost, that the foundations of this country, and I now refer to it as a federation of states because actually it was a country led and taken care for by indigenous peoples, is a federation of states, loosely affiliated, grounded in white supremacy, capitalism, and an overall sense of patriarchy. Evaluation is an artifact of that truth, and we can no longer escape that reality. And so we have to do something fundamentally different. And as I sit here in my home here in San Rafael, California, originally the territories of the Coast Miwok, and I look outside and I can see some of the smoke from the fires. We're not affected by the fires directly, fortunately, but our caretaking of our country is resulting in fires that are burning throughout California, and I can see the smoke, and my windows are closed. I'm aware that we're kind of at a turning point, and my ask, challenge, mission at this moment is for evaluation to step up to that ask and actually be fundamentally different, which means we as practitioners who have chosen this as our craft or part of our toolkit have to acknowledge who we are in this work, how we are in this work, our worldviews and our mindsets that shape what we see, what we don't see, what we understand, how we're perceived, and we have to step into this work as humans. I feel as if our work has lost its humanity, and as a result, it's actually done harm. It's reinforced narratives, it's done damage, and I just can't sit with that anymore. So part of what I ask all of you to do as you listen in is you think about yourself as the instrument of change, in addition to the methods and approaches you might use, the clients that you choose, and the issues that you work on, that you are actually part of that as well. So this requires some personal work that we perhaps are not equipped to do, don't want to do, certainly isn't part of our graduate education process for the most part, but if you're really into creating a world that looks fundamentally different than what it looks like today, you have to be part of the change yourself. So let's go back in time and let's do a little bit of history. Again, this is situated in US, and what I refer to is the philanthropic, the settler-created philanthropic industrial complex. I got that language from some of my brethren up in Canada, and they use settler-created, and I think that's really important language because there are many manifestations of philanthropy that don't have the command and control that we have here in the United States. So again, I think it's just super important to name what we often don't name here in evaluation practice because it makes the values and belief systems implicit. So I'm just going to do some high-level things. Whenever I look at this slide, I'm always reminded just of what was happening in those decades, who had power, who didn't, and that always makes me think twice around what am I carrying forward in the third decade of the 21st century that was rooted in the 60s, right? So 1960s, evaluation was really evaluation research. It really sort of came into being around the Great Society. It focused on investments in social programming, really at the individual level. So those words around longitudinal, around causal effect, around scale, around randomized controlled trial, all those things that we tend to hold as the gold standard started in the 1960s. And we bring them forward even though the work has fundamentally transformed in the third decade of the 21st century. In the 1970s, shortly after the passage of the Charitable Tax Act, which allowed for high wealth individuals, primarily white, male, cisgender, industrialists, capitalists, and scientists, to hide their wealth in tax shelters known as trusts and foundations, they realized that they had to get ahead of Congress. And so what they did was they decided what evaluation meant to them. So they decided what evaluation meant to them. It was the best defense is a good offense. So evaluation did not come into philanthropy because people were fundamentally interested in mission. It came into philanthropy because it was a way to protect their assets, right? Super, super important. In addition, think about Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, even Johnson. Those individuals were used to a way of thinking about measurement and tracking that was highly quantitative. Any EKC Foundation, UPS. And so some of those ways in which we think about evaluation were rooted in the mindsets of those individuals who thought about outputs, about scale, about numbers, not about context, not about narrative, not about story, not about what was not generalizable, but actually what was generalizable for efficiencies. 1980s, 1990s, evaluators got kicked out of the federal government because no one was interested in data in the way in which they were before. They looked over across the mountain and they saw philanthropy, and they said, we're going to go to philanthropy. And they brought with them their mindsets and approaches that grew out of the federal frame. So again, evaluators who work in philanthropy in the early days and really situated evaluation in those places didn't do it with a purpose of mission. They brought existing methods and mindsets into that place, right? So nothing really grew in philanthropy. It all came from different places around love of person and around mission. Bring us now to the 21st century. We have high-tech individuals, we have social entrepreneurs, we have a bunch of 20-something billionaires, all interested in social change in various ways. So the marketplace has gotten really full in terms of who's interested in social change, as well as what their ideas are around what does change look like and how do I measure, document, describe, and demonstrate that. Social impact investing is one of those things as well. So it has gotten to be a very messy and complicated environment. Add to that foundations and funders, although they still invest in individual interventions, for lack of another term, they're also thinking about social change. They're thinking about public policy and public advocacy. They're thinking about narrative. They're thinking about power. The types of work that they're investing in and thinking about and changes that they're looking at have so moved beyond school reading scores for third graders. And yet many of our methodologies and methods for thinking about that haven't changed at all. We've just tinkered. The good thing is that since the beginning of time, however you define time, we have always been somewhat self-reflective, and we've continued to push ourselves, and we begin to push and stretch and think about who, what, how, but we've never really thought about the why. Why are we in this business of evaluation? To what end? And so what we believe is that we're a critical point, and we really need to get to that. Did anyone have any questions? I want to see if anyone has any questions before I go on. Beverly?
Nothing yet. I'll keep you posted if anything pops up.
Nothing? Okay, great. All right. So briefly want to talk about some of the evaluation underpinnings. Often when you ask someone about evaluation, they immediately ask what method you're going to use. So we have implicitly assumed or taken on a set of beliefs around evidence, knowledge, and truth that are embedded in our methodologies, and we haven't interrogated them. And at the Equitable Evaluation Initiative, we think we can no longer afford to do that, that we actually have to take a stand around what is good and what is right. Now in philanthropy, and albeit there's not full agreement on this, I think we can decide what is right. And what our offer here is, is what we're talking about is equity. We're talking about both means and ends. I'm going to read out the definitions. So means, deep equity means working towards outcomes in ways that model dignity, justice, and love without recreating harm in our structures, strategies, and working relationships. And then for ends, equity is the absence of avoidable or remediable differences among groups of people, whether those groups are defined socially, economically, demographically, or geographically, from the World Health Organization. Right, so we think that evaluative work at this moment in time within philanthropy and perhaps in other places really needs to be about contributing to equity, and not only the practice of evaluation, but the ways in which it might advance progress towards equity in its own work. So what we're really talking about is a paradigm shift, a fundamental shift. Not just a tweaking on the edges, not just saying if you speak a different language or come from a different culture, that in fact you can do the work that's needed to be done, but that we have to fundamentally change the paradigm, right? And you have to acknowledge that there actually is a paradigm. So in the initiative, what we really try to focus on is who has had that, what I refer to as an aha, oh no moment, where they understand the roots of the United States, how that has shaped everything, including our concepts of knowledge and validity and rigor, and where evaluation sits in relationship to those. They can't unsee it. They situate themselves in that work, and they want to chart a new way. And so those are the people, primarily in philanthropy, for the reasons I stated earlier, who have come to us in the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. We're starting to explore what it might look like to be in relationship with consultants. And we have some light touches with higher ed. This is one of them, who self-identify and reach out and say, there's something there we'd like for you to share with our community. So here's the invitation. It's to reimagine the purpose and practice of evaluation. It's to reimagine it. It's not to change the method, it's not to change the face or the language, but to fundamentally reimagine the purpose and the practice. We've primarily focused on the purpose, on the practice, but not so much the purpose. So the framework are these two pieces. Again, sitting in philanthropy doesn't mean that they don't have resonance with other sectors, but the research started in philanthropy is a set of principles and then a set of orthodoxies. And that's really what we're focusing on. And it's called the Equitable Evaluation Framework. It is not a method, it's a mindset and a set of ways of being in the work that influence how you do the work and how you think about the work. So I'm going to read these out. The first principle is evaluation and evaluative work should be in service of equity. Production, consumption, and management of evaluation and evaluative work should hold at its core a responsibility to advance progress towards equity. Full stop. That's the axiological shift. If you believe in that, then you cannot and you will not go back. For those that have joined us in this work, and some joined us in the work, 2018, and now we're in fall 2020 almost, once they have that aha moment, they've continued to find ways to be different in relationship to their colleagues around evaluation, how they're thinking about questions, how they're thinking about grantees, community, absolutely everything has changed for them, right? The second principle is that evaluative work should be designed and implemented commensurate with the values underlying equity work, which means we have to expand our definitions of validity and we have to be oriented towards participant ownership. And when I say oriented towards participant ownership, that does not mean, or I don't want to say this, that does not necessarily mean that everything goes to the community. That is not what this is saying. And because we live in the US and we seem to work in binaries, that tends to be how people interpret this. It actually means that the knowledge that is generated through the work is shared and owned by those who've given themselves to answer the questions that we over ask them, right? So it's more sophisticated than I don't do it as the consultant or foundation and now you do it as the community. It's how do we acknowledge that through the process of evaluation, we generate knowledge, hopefully collectively. In worst case, we take knowledge and insights from other people, we claim them as our own, and we know we don't give it back to them for ways that they can use. It's an extractive science. And so this principle in particular speaks to that. And it also speaks to how do we reimagine what validity looks like? How do we move beyond statistical validity and really get more nuanced around power, around voice, around control, which are things we tend not to sort for when we're putting together our wonderful samples. We look for representative samples across SES, and we think that all Black folks that are poor are the same, all white folks that are poor that are the same, and not really paying attention to different nuances around maybe who's been in that community longer, what's their status in that community, what might be their particular agenda, whose voices need to be heard even within groups that we don't hear a lot from. We just have to get more nuanced around that. And part of that is we don't have proximity, right? We're not part of the work. And then the last principle is that evaluative work can and should answer critical questions about the ways in which historical and structural decisions have contributed to the condition to be addressed. This happens in philanthropy a lot, that the moment an investment happens, that seems to be when time began. What this asks really of the evaluator is to recognize that where we are now is a reflection of decisions and choices made decades, sometimes centuries earlier, and how do we bring that clarity into the work so we can help our clients decide, understand if and how and where their solutions might actually have the possibility of shedding light on or even changing some of those barriers that have been built into the process. The effective strategy on the underlying systemic drivers of inequity. Again, thinking about the root causes that lead to some of what we're seeing now blatantly, always present, but just more present for some folks right now. And then the last one is really about cultural context. It can speak to not only how you as the evaluator, as an instrument, are getting caught up in the initiative and the change. What are you bringing to it, and how is that perhaps conflating or confusing things? But also, how might the philanthropy or whoever the funder is? What are the ways in which how they're getting their money or how they got their money or decisions they might have even been making in other portfolios actually be affecting what's happening in the intervention that you're actually trying to evaluate? So these are the three principles. Before I go forward, I want to see if anybody has any questions. If anyone wants to dig into anything.
There was one question that came through. I don't know if you want to address it now or later.
Yeah, let's do it.
I'm a white woman. In the USA, white women seem to dominate evaluation.
True.
How would you suggest I reimagine myself and my role in evaluation?
That's a big question, and I bet other people have thoughts on that. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is, yeah, you're a white woman. Cool. There's nothing wrong with that. And because of that, you see the world and have a limited set of experiences, just like I do as a Black woman. And so how do you bring more humility to the work and understand what you know and don't know, should say or not say? And who else needs to be part of your team to either help you or, even more importantly, help the client and the work really deepen what's valid and rigorous? That's what I would say. Acknowledge who you are and figure out how that either advances or limits your ability to be of service. And the evaluative work, the evaluative world is super white. It's super white female. There isn't anything we can do about that at this particular moment. I think it will shift, hopefully, in the decades to come, but right now it is what it is. And so just own that and figure out how you might be in allyship with others who might be interested in this work. And if somebody else has a response to that, they should feel free to figure out how to respond.
Yeah. I've got another question here from Leslie. Can you describe the ways people are different when they start to believe in the service of equity statement? What does this concretely mean for their evaluation practice?
So it looks different for different people. So let's be super clear about that. What it is tended to look like for the people we work most often with at this particular moment, which are foundation staff, who are directors of research and evaluation, usually in fairly large foundations, is they start to position themselves not as experts, but as people who have expertise. They bring a different degree of humility to the work. They are in relationship with their allies within their foundation, asking different sets of questions, trying to understand what the ultimate purpose is of the intervention or the grant making. They start to rethink their questions that they ask of their consultants. What are they really trying to look for in a consultant partner that can help them do the evaluation work different? They start to think about so that shows up in the RFRs, all of the RF things. They start to think about what are the questions that they are seeking to have answered in the evaluation work, and whether or not those answers serve them, or whether they actually serve the larger whole of the grantee. They start to think about how to engage the grantee in sense making, so that they don't overstate what they believe to be true. It shows up in a myriad of different ways.
And I'll just give one more question and then you can continue on with the slides from Doran. So we are saying that evaluation is not about answering a question, but rather about promoting equity. What is the work to promote this mindset for clients?
So what I would say is it's not about either or, it's both and. So it's about what are the questions that, if answered and how answered, both help us make progress towards equity, and that the process of that inquiry and the sense making around that inquiry also reflects the value of equity. So it's not either or, it's both and. Questions are important. It's important for us to understand things, which things for which people, for what reason, are the most important things for us to know, and who gets to decide. And in terms of mindsets, and this is something I just got off a call with talking to people about, is I would say that if you have a client, well, there's two things. I'm going to say two things. Ideally, people like to start with the equity work. Either your client has had conversations around equity or they haven't. You should figure out that. If they haven't, this is probably not the entry point for them, principle one. But everyone needs to get better, valid data. Our data isn't very valid because our worldview is super limited and scaled. It is a white dominant view that is simplistic. It seeks generalizability. It seeks scalability. It lacks nuance. It lacks all the things that are thriving and alive in the 21st century. So if anything, you can challenge them on validity. So that's second part of the second principle. And then depending on who they are, you can also start to think about some of the sub-elements in principle 3, where you talk about structural and systematic. Again, asking the question to them, are they just trying to fix what is in front of them, or are they trying to make sure that it never happens again? And those are all strategy questions. So you, as someone who is a consultant, trying to understand some of those responses as you decide who you spend your time with and who you take money from, can help you think about what aspects of the principles will resonate most as you do your work with them.
I'll do one more question and then you can.
I'm here to answer questions. Ask questions, Beverly. Stop apologizing.
This comes from Rachel. Do you have any advice for those of us who are not evaluators, but those being evaluated? How do we deal with trying to fit our work into what grantors and foundations want to see in order to get the funding we need when we know that their evaluative frameworks are all wrong?
Yeah, so that sucks. So just want to be super clear. That's just true. A couple things that I can offer up for you is, and I know this is hard, is be more thoughtful about who you take money from. So that's one thing I would say. Oftentimes, and on my other hat, I have nonprofit clients. I have seen nonprofit clients give over power that they have not asked, challenged, or even offered up alternative ways of thinking about evaluative practice to their funders. You may not get a yes all the time, but the degree to which you're able to say, I hear what you're saying and we've done our own work and here's what we think would be better, that positions you in a different relationship with your funder around what the evaluative work should look like. And that is work for some of our clients.
Yeah.
You stop taking money from some, and then for others are like, if that's what you want, then that's what we're going to give you, and we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on doing those numbers. Great, here are your numbers. We're going to take your money and we're actually going to commit to doing the evaluative work that we really need to do to understand our progress towards mission.
And
Beverly, don't you apologize again. Just ask me the question.
But I do have a question from Michael. You mentioned 21st century definitions of validity and complexity. Can you explain that more?
Well, I think some of them are in the readings for you, but they're actually, so there's the Cynefin framework around what complexity is. So you can look that up. Most of what evaluation has been designed to do is to work in the controlled environment. We're actually in complexity, and some might even say chaos. I actually think we aren't in chaos. I think because we have such a desire to control and command our environment that what looks like chaos to us is actually just the natural evolution of things. I think our mindsets are limited, but I would look at that. And then Dr. Donna Mertens has, I think it's 9 points that she has around what multicultural validity looks like. And whenever I've asked anybody what elements of those they think of in terms of their own validity, there's like 2 of the 9. And that's not saying that you should get all 9, but you should know that they're 9 and which ones are most important to your work. And then there are other definitions of validity, you know, there again, and validity is just a weird white term too. So I don't even know what it actually really means when we're doing some of the work. Valid to whom, for what reason, right? So a lot of the words that we use are an artifact of different people in a different time. And how do they really translate into what you're doing now is also just an important thing for you to think about.
An interesting question from Madison. Are there any different or additional considerations that would be needed for an internal evaluator as opposed to a consultant when approaching equitable evaluation?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Nope.
And one more from Rasheen. I'm an international development consultant. It seems that much of the work I do is quantitative. This comes from the TOR from USAID, for example. How can I work with the donor on amplifying voices equitably?
That's a really good one. And I moved to the next slide because I think this one, second row, third one from the left that says credible evidence comes from quantitative data and experimental research is what you're struggling with. What I can direct you to, and perhaps Beverly can send it out post, is that there's a series of writings from the Center for the Study of Social Policy. It's a series of blogs where we actually talk about this, and I think I actually have a writing in there that talks about voice, values, and validity. That numbers in and of themselves are numbers which somebody who was a human made a host of decisions about that are not made transparent. Numbers just don't arrive. I made decisions around sample, around statistical formulas, around analysis, all of it, how it's presented. And then somehow we forget that when we talk about things. And so to the degree to which it's useful for you to be explicit about all the choices that are made to get to numbers and what are the values implicit that were inform that, that may help your donor. It may or may not, but there's also, I would go to that Center for the Study of Social Policy, and there's some writings on there. We don't need either or, we need both and other ways of knowing that we've yet to imagine, which is usually what I say. Numbers in and of themselves don't tell the whole story, and neither do words. But we are binary, and a lot of the research and approaches that are in international development are actually colonizing ways of thinking about evidence. You probably don't want to say that to your donor. Pretty sure that'll be a trigger, but I mean, that's part of the artifact, right? Is that it's white dominant framing that shows up in colonial knowledge generation.
Those are all the questions so far.
All right. So here, great
conversation so far. Just keep the questions rolling in, people.
Yeah, please do. So here are some of the orthodoxies that emerge in philanthropy. Again, settler created U.S. industrial complex. These are some of the norms that happen. All of these norms are interesting manifestations of white dominant characteristics. They reflect an expert, control, preoccupation with metrics, this idea of neutrality and objectivity, which actually implicitly centers whiteness, and that the production of things, which is our lovely bid to adieu to capitalism, is actually embedded in this, right? So these are some of the things that you push up against in the philanthropic industrial complex that get in the way of the principles. But what we have learned with working with some of our partners is that they can figure out which ones of these they might be able to push on, mitigate, eliminate potentially, and that allows them more space to figure out which of the principles they might be able to advance. We haven't yet done research with nonprofits yet, but suspect that some of these actually translate over because of the funding, how funding happens. And other ones I can think of for nonprofits are them not thinking that evaluation is part of their work. Like evaluation is something that you do for a funder. So back to the earlier question around how do I navigate with my funder? And it was great that you said, because whatever they're asking me for doesn't make sense. My question to you would be is, do you have something that makes sense? Because often what happens is nonprofits say, we want your money, but we don't want to answer your questions, but they actually don't have another set of questions that they're holding themselves accountable for to actually answering, because their mission is their work. Progress towards your mission is your work. I fundamentally believe that all of us should be working ourselves out of a job. I'm constantly trying to figure out how I am no longer needed, how whatever I bring gets internalized with whomever I'm working with, and we move on to something else or they move on to somebody else, right? Most nonprofits don't hold that as core. If you hold that as core, the questions you ask of yourselves will be fundamentally different than what you ask of yourselves now, and probably even what your funders ask of you, right? So that part of the nonprofit industrial complex isn't central, which I think sets up this weird dynamic between funders, foundations, public sector, and the nonprofit sector. Does anyone have any question about any of the orthodoxies?
Well, Latoya has a question.
Go ahead.
When she's developing an RFP, what should she make sure to include to shape our value of equitable evaluation principles?
I would ask whoever you're asking what their values are. I'd ask them. And how do those values show up in their work? Like, it doesn't have to be a trick question. We have a partner who, when they, I guess it was probably about 18 months ago, they started asking staff that they were recruiting what were the ways in which their identities showed up in their work. And if people looked like deer in headlights, they knew that they didn't have enough self-awareness to actually bring that to work. Really simple question, but it revealed how much that person understood the shadow, back to my, like one of my earlier slides, that they had in their own space. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Question from Dorian. Often the intervention or program is not equitable. So how do we frame an evaluation to promote equity? It seems that the fundamental change has to start with the intervention and the organization.
It does, and I went back to the slide because there's ways that you could, in your evaluation questions, ask and try to reveal some of the historical, structural, and underlying systemic drivers in your evaluation to reveal that to the funder. They can decide not to do anything about it, but at least you revealed them. Right? So that's a way in which you can be less complicit by not pretending that a whole host of decisions didn't lead to whatever the thing is. And ultimately, you don't have control over strategy and program. So that's part of the sometimes difficult part of being a third-party consultant is you can bring all this wisdom and insight, and they will do with it what they want because you don't have that degree of control, but you can put things in front of them that you can at least say, well, I showed it to them. So that's one thing you can do.
That's all the questions that have come in so far.
Okay, great. All right. So, and this is the last slide, so we can open it up and have more conversation. And I know a colleague of mine, I know Katrina is on the line as well. So the real work starts with questioning the frame, which comes from Maria Rosario Jackson, who's at the Kresge Foundation and is also at Arizona State University. I always love this quote from her. It means that there's a frame. There is a frame which evaluation currently promotes and perpetrates with implicit definitions around validity, around rigor, and around truth. And a axiological stance that says it's neutral, but actually privileges whiteness. It's just true. And so once you question that frame, what are the implications for the evaluative work that you do? So that you are super intentional and transparent around why you ask what you ask, who you ask it of, what you're going to do with those findings, who's going to make sense of those findings, all of those things. So the real work starts with questioning the frame, which means acknowledging that there is a frame.
Question from Shadi. Is there a particular field that seems to integrate equitable evaluation better than others? Education, public health, international development?
Well, two things. One, I would say it's not equitable evaluation, it's the Equitable Evaluation Framework, right? So it's a set of principles. It's not a methodology. It has methodological implications, but it's a set of principles. So one thing. The second is in terms of who has approached us most around this work, it's tend to be foundations that do health conversion foundations. So folks with public health backgrounds. I think that's primarily because, and I have a master's in public health, is that over the past 20 or so years, and probably more so in the last sort of 10 years, there's a recognition of the impact of structural and systemic drivers on the public's health. So they get the underlying root causes. So they're definitely interested in unpacking evaluation in that way. Where they get tripped up is because they still have a medical model around data, is they still like numbers. So we're trying to figure out what that looks like. But they understand the complexity of the principles and what it reveals or will reveal to them in terms of understanding their work. We're still trying to figure out how we recalibrate what they believe is data, right? And people think data are numbers. Numbers are one type of data. They're not the only type of data, and sometimes they're not the best data for us to use given what we're trying to do.
I've got a couple of questions from Leslie.
Okay.
What does an equitable framework look like? One that doesn't privilege whiteness. I'm trying to concretely understand how my whiteness defines this frame, and I want to know what the alternatives really look like.
So that's a great question, and part of what we try to do, and so maybe I'll give you, because I have a couple of minutes to talk about what the Equitable Evaluation Initiative is. So the initiative is a 5-year initiative. We are 2 years? No, we have 3 years and 4 months left. We're trying to do what we refer to is seed a field of practitioners, meaning these are people who have had an aha moment around what evaluation is, what its basis is, its historical underpinnings, its theoretical underpinnings, its axiology, its epistemology, its ontology, and thus its methodological implications. They get that, and they're like, that's not going to serve us anymore. We want to do a new way. So what we're trying to do is find those people, and those people are charting the course. Not everyone can see, how do I want to say this? Not everyone can see what's possible. Other people have to see it once it's been operationalized. So in answer to your question, Leslie, I don't have an answer for it yet because the work is happening now. And some people are more comfortable in the ambiguity of creating new ways, and other people are less so. I would also say it's not about your whiteness. This isn't about you, although we all are part of the world and system and knowledge generation in this country. It's about evaluation is situated in whiteness. And as a consequence, it is limiting because it sees and privileges certain ways of thinking, being, and doing that are based on a white dominant frame. And that's what we're trying to unpack. So hold tight. We will know and learn and see more in the coming years. But that work is happening within institutions that have had that recalibration and are imagining new ways of being in the work. Thus, they're thinking differently about the work. And as a consequence, they're able to do the work differently.
I have a question from Mariana.
Sure.
I'm a Latin American social scientist entering now in the world of evaluation. What you say resonates a lot. Here's my question. Usually qualitative research is intrinsically biased in the sense of erasing some social complexities in favor of accurate data. Can you please give me a practical example of how you would measure an indicator following the EEF principles into consideration? Is it only possible in quantitative terms?
Are you saying, can you read the question again? Because I feel like quantitative and qualitative was inverted.
Yeah, quantitative research is intrinsically biased in the sense of erasing some social complexities in favor of aggregate data. Yeah, can you please give a practical example of how you would measure an indicator following the EEF principles into consideration? Yeah.
I don't actually even know how to answer that question.
Is this only possible in qualitative terms? So I think the question is around how do we do this quantitatively?
Well, first I'd say it's a both and, it's not an either or, right? So yeah, I think it's a both and it's not an either or. It's not, is it numbers or letters, right? It is, what do the letters tell you about the numbers, and what is the explicitness by which you say how you got to the numbers? Like, what were the values made explicitly that led you to the decisions around the statistical analysis that you did? What did it keep in? What did it kick out? And what can you say and not say about the certainty of those numbers? So it's not an either or, it's a both and.
A question from Monica. My work is not in philanthropy, but education. You talked about the Equitable Evaluation Initiative as a mindset and not a method. Given the equity issues related to education, how do we evaluate equity equitably? Thinking how we translate the mindset to a process and methods. I can see the mindset influencing process, but I'm less clear on how the methods need to change other than to incorporate multiple methods and innovate new methods.
I think you just answered the question. Yeah. You have to innovate new methods.
Another question from Michael.
And that's what people are doing, right? And that's what people are doing. And they're also acknowledging the limitations of current methods.
Right.
Right. It's not about throwing things out necessarily. It's about understanding and being explicit about the limitations of what they say and don't say. Part of white dominant framing is a desire for a degree of certainty and control that is problematic. So we proclaim a lot of truths in our work and evaluation, because we feel good about being experts that are half-truths at best. Sometimes they're actually just lies because we haven't really raised the bar on validity, and what we're telling is a very small piece of the picture, but we hold it as the only picture.
Question from Michael. You talked about the binary. I'm thinking you mean the either or and focus on numbers.
Yep.
Or are there other components to that?
No, I think as we in the US, we do either or. We swing left, we swing right, we do black, we do white. Like, we are just binary in this country. Our language is binary, right? We don't have language. It's very male, female, right? So how do we get to a place where there's just more fluidity, right? That's why we called it's evolutionary, right? We don't know how to do some of what we need to do in the 21st century because we're operating from a 1960s, 70s frame. Some people can see that and say, okay, some of that I'll take forward and I can create new frames that make sense for as long as they make sense. Other people are like, I get it, but I can't see what's different until somebody puts it in front of me. That's fine. Part of our work is for people to filter where they are in that continuum, to understand that we are limited. What people will do for evaluative practice in 2090 will be different than what they're doing in 2020. It's just time for us to rethink what we're pulling forward in this incredibly complex world. And can we afford to do something that actually isn't about something anymore? When our planets are burning, our planet is burning, literally burning and melting, right? When people are being thrown out of their houses today, when the federal government is no longer privileging the rights of those it's deemed to protect, you know, it's a hot mess out there. I personally can't be involved in evaluative work that doesn't contribute to that not being the world that we live in the future. But that's my decision. I don't want to do that anymore. You have to decide what's the work you want to do and where you want to put your passion. For many, the Equitable Evaluation Framework is a way for them to bring in alignment what they thought they were doing in the work with the practice that they've chosen. And now they're able to become more integrated humans in their work. Some folks want that, some folks don't. It's a choice. It's your call.
A comment and a question from Leslie. Fantastic. Thanks very much for this. Can I sign up for updates? I teach evaluation to project staff all over the world. This would be a very interesting topic for my students.
What you can do is go to the Equitable Evaluation org website and you can sign up. And we provide updates to only people who tell us they want updates.
And a question from Cindy. My background is creating measurement systems in corporate America, and I am looking to widen my skills to a more holistic framework and enter the nonprofit world, ideally in international development. This has been a very helpful discussion, and I am wondering if you can provide some ideas for digging deep into the field, books, authors, etc.
You can go to the Equitable Evaluation website and there's some readings there. That might be helpful. Again, most of our work is situated in the US, but some of the foundational readings that I did were actually out of UNICEF. So those are still pretty important. But yeah, I would direct you to that. And then of course, there's been a lot of work around sort of indigenous evaluation frameworks, and then what's happening sort of in Hawaii, Pacific Islander, and things of that nature. So I think the degree to which you can read things that aren't written by, that are not written by white folks, for the most part, you will begin to see that there are different ways in which people are in the world, and thus they see the world differently.
And a final question from Jacob. Can you talk a little bit about culturally responsive and equitable evaluation and why these terms are oftentimes put together?
I cannot, because I do not put them together. So I actually can't speak to that. As I said before, equitable evaluation, I don't know what that is. What I'm speaking about is the Equitable Evaluation Framework, which is a set of principles. To my understanding, the culturally responsive evaluation is a methodology. They relate, but they are not the same thing. So I don't actually know what CRE is. I think Dr. Katrina Bledsoe was on. I don't know if she's still on. And I think she might be able to shed some light on that or not. And I think she's your next speaker.
Indeed, she is on the September 17th panel. So
Yep.
I would recommend that people dial in for that one as well. It looks like we don't have any more questions for today. I want to thank you for leading this webinar and thank you to the audience for joining us today. This webinar is sponsored by American University's Measurement and Evaluation Program. We have a Master's of Science degree, a certificate program, and badge courses in evaluation. If you want any more information about our programs, you can call or email us at the addresses on the slide. Please connect with me on LinkedIn or with the School of Professional and Extended Studies on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Instagram for more information about our September 17th webinar on culturally responsive and equitable evaluation. Thank you very much for joining us and thank you for leading us in this really important discussion today.
Great. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.